They laughed because I came to my husband's funeral in a faded gray coat and scuffed black shoes. But by the time the lawyer walked through the chapel doors, every smile in that room had disappeared. I was 71 years old that morning, old enough to know that cruelty does not always shout. Sometimes it hides behind pearl earrings, polished nails, and whispered jokes in the back pew of a church. My name is Eleanor Whitaker, and for 43 years I was married to Thomas Whitaker, a quiet man who believed a family name meant something. He built Whitaker Hardware from a single storefront in Cedar Rapids into 3 locations across eastern Iowa. And even after his hands grew stiff with age, he still opened the main shop every Saturday because he said people trusted seeing him there. I had stood beside him through lean winters, unpaid invoices, late-night inventory counts, and years when our son, Grant, was too young to understand why his father came home smelling like sawdust and motor oil. I was there before the money, before the brick house on Hawthorne Lane, before the country club invitations, before my daughter-in-law, Madison, learned to smile at me like I was a stain she was too polite to mention. The morning of Thomas's funeral, I stood in front of my closet for almost 20 minutes, looking at dresses that no longer felt like mine. Madison had called the night before and reminded me that the service would be photographed for the family memorial page. Her voice had been soft, careful, almost sweet. "Eleanor, just try to look presentable. This is important for Grant. Not for Thomas. Not for me. For Grant." I chose the gray coat because Thomas had bought it for me 12 Christmases earlier at a small department store during a snowstorm. The lining was worn near the cuffs, and one button had been replaced with one that did not quite match. My shoes were old, too. Practical. The kind I could stand in without pain. At 71, comfort becomes less of a choice and more of a negotiation with your own body. I pinned my silver hair back, put on the small pearl earrings Thomas gave me on our 30th anniversary, and drove myself 12 miles to St. Mark's Chapel with my hands steady on the wheel and his wedding band in my coat pocket. No one offered to pick me up. No one asked if I could manage. When I arrived, the parking lot was already full of polished cars and black SUVs. Inside, white lilies lined the aisle, their scent too sweet, almost heavy. A framed photo of Thomas stood near the casket, but it was not the photo I would have chosen. Madison had selected one from a charity gala, Thomas in a tuxedo, smiling stiffly beside donors he barely knew. My Thomas had smiled with his eyes. This photograph did not know him. I had just stepped into the chapel when I heard the first laugh. Small, quickly swallowed. Then another. Madison stood near the front with Grant beside her. Her black dress fitted perfectly, her blonde hair arranged like she had stepped out of a magazine. She looked past me, then down at my coat, then at my shoes. Her lips curved. Not enough for strangers to notice. Enough for me. She wore that, someone whispered behind a folded program. Grant's cousin lowered her eyes, pretending to read. Madison touched Grant's sleeve and murmured something I could not hear. He looked at me then, really looked, and instead of grief or concern, I saw embarrassment pass across his face like a shadow. My only child was ashamed of how his mother looked at his father's funeral. I walked forward anyway, slowly. Each step sounded too loud against the chapel floor. I sat in the second pew because the first had been filled with Madison's family, though I had been Thomas's wife for more than 4 decades. My name was not printed on the front of the program. It said, Thomas Whitaker, beloved father, grandfather, businessman, and friend. Husband had been left out. I ran my thumb over the paper once, then folded it neatly in my lap. I did not cry, not because I was strong, because something colder had settled over the grief. Then, just as the pastor opened his Bible, the chapel doors creaked behind us. Every head turned. A tall man in a navy suit stepped inside, holding a leather folder against his chest. I knew him immediately. Harold Bennett, Thomas's attorney. Madison's smile faded before he even reached the aisle. Harold Bennett did not hurry, and that made his entrance feel even heavier. He walked down the aisle with the calm steps of a man who had spent his life entering rooms where people were pretending not to be afraid. I felt Madison stiffen in the pew ahead of me. Grant turned his head just enough to see who had come in, and for the first time that morning, the embarrassed look on his face changed into something uncertain. Harold stopped beside the second pew, looked directly at me, and gave a small, respectful nod. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said quietly. 2 words. That was all. But after an hour of being treated like an unwanted guest at my own husband's service, Hearing my proper name spoken with dignity almost broke something open inside me. I nodded back, keeping my hands folded over the program where the word wife should have been. The pastor paused, clearly unsure whether to continue. Madison rose halfway from her seat, smoothing the front of her black dress with both hands. "Mr. Bennett," she whispered, though her voice carried farther than she intended. "This is really not the time." Harold looked at her, not unkindly, but without yielding an inch. "I understand the timing is difficult," he said. Thomas was very specific. The chapel went still. Even the small rustle of programs stopped. I could feel people looking from Harold to Madison, then to Grant, then to me in my worn gray coat. Until that moment, they had seen me as a sad old woman who had arrived poorly dressed and sat in the wrong pew. Now they were beginning to wonder what else they had misunderstood. Madison gave a tight smile, the kind she used when a waiter brought the wrong wine at dinner. "Whatever business you have can wait until after the service." Harold adjusted the folder under his arm. "No, Mrs. Grant Whitaker. It cannot." He said her name carefully, and that was the first cut. "Not Mrs. Whitaker. Mrs. Grant Whitaker." Madison's cheeks flushed, but she sat down because everyone was watching. The pastor cleared his throat and asked if there was a matter that needed to be addressed. Harold replied that he had been instructed by Thomas Whitaker himself to be present before the first. Formal remarks were given. I had known Thomas kept things from me near the end, not out of cruelty, but because he had been tired and protective in that old-fashioned way men of his generation sometimes mistake for kindness. In the final months, he had spent several afternoons at Harold's office and told me only that he was getting papers in order. I had not pressed him. I was too busy counting pills, changing bed linens, and pretending not to notice how much lighter his hand felt in mine. Harold turned toward the room. "Before we proceed, I need to clarify one matter regarding the family memorial program and the seating arrangement." A soft murmur passed through the chapel. Madison's mother leaned toward her husband. Grant stared straight ahead. I looked down at my shoes, the scuffed leather dull beneath the hem of my black dress, and remembered Thomas kneeling in our kitchen years ago to polish them before a church anniversary dinner because my arthritis had been acting up. "Ellie," he had said, using the name only he used for me. "A woman should never have to bend when she has spent her whole life holding everyone else up." I had laughed then. I did not laugh now. Harold opened the folder. Thomas Whitaker left written instructions for today's service. Those instructions were filed with my office, signed, witnessed, and dated 6 weeks ago. Madison turned sharply toward Grant. "Did you know about this?" she whispered. Grant shook his head, and the fear in that small movement told me he had expected to control this day. Maybe Madison had expected it more. Harold continued. His first instruction was that his wife, Eleanor May Whitaker, be seated in the front pew as the primary mourner and surviving spouse. My breathing slowed. Madison's hand tightened around the edge of her program. His second instruction was that the printed memorial acknowledge her as his wife of 43 years and co-founder of the family business. A woman behind me gasped softly. Co-founder. That word had not been spoken in public for nearly 20 years. People liked the cleaner story, the easier story, the one where Thomas built everything alone while I appeared later in pearls. And holiday photographs. They did not remember me unloading boxes in the first store while 7 months pregnant. They did not remember me keeping ledgers at the kitchen table after midnight, calling customers when invoices ran late, bringing Grant to the shop in a playpen because we could not afford childcare. Thomas remembered. Harold looked toward the pastor. "The program distributed today does not reflect Mr. Whitaker's approved language." Madison stood fully this time. "This is inappropriate," she said, her voice thinner now. "We are here to honor Thomas, not discuss stationery." Harold closed the folder halfway and met her eyes. "Mrs. Whitaker has been publicly diminished in violation of his explicit wishes." Thomas anticipated that possibility. The room changed after that. I felt it the way you feel a storm press against old windows before rain begins. Madison's polished face had gone pale beneath her makeup. Grant finally turned to me, and this time he did not look ashamed of my coat. He looked ashamed of himself, though not yet enough to speak. Harold stepped aside and gestured toward the front pew. "Mrs. Whitaker, your husband asked that you take your rightful place before we continue." For a moment, I could not move. Not because I was weak, but because the kindness landed harder than the insult had. Then I stood, smoothed my coat, and walked past the people who had laughed. I felt every pair of eyes follow me as I moved from the second pew to the first. No one spoke. Even Madison stepped back, though she did it with the stiff dignity of someone who believed retreat was only temporary. I sat where Thomas had wanted me to sit, directly in front of his casket, close enough to see the small silver tie clip I had chosen for him years ago. Madison had changed almost everything else about the service, but she had missed that. The tie clip was shaped like a tiny hardware key, a private joke from the early store days when Thomas said I held the keys to the business because I was the only one who knew where anything was. I rested my hands in my lap and let the memory settle there quietly. The pastor began again, but the room no longer belonged to Madison. Her family sat rigid along the front row extension, their perfect posture unable to hide their discomfort. Grant stood beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the carpet. I wondered when my son had become a man who needed permission from his wife to show decency to his mother. He had not always been that way. As a boy, Grant used to run through the aisles of the hardware store with a red licorice rope in one hand, calling me the boss lady because customers came to me when Thomas was busy. In high school, he brought friends home without warning because he knew I would stretch a pot roast into dinner for 6. Even after college, before Madison, he still called on Sunday evenings. Then the calls became shorter. Then Madison started answering his phone. Then family dinners moved from my dining room to restaurants where she chose the table, the menu, and the version of events everyone was expected to accept. The pastor spoke about Thomas's loyalty, his generosity, his quiet humor. People nodded. Some dabbed their eyes. I listened, but behind every sentence I heard what was missing. No one mentioned the winter of 1989 when the furnace failed in the store and Thomas wanted to close for a week, but I made coffee for every employee in the back room and kept the register running with gloves on. No one mentioned the second mortgage we took on our first house, or the year I worked mornings at the school office and evenings on store accounts because payroll came before pride. A widow learns quickly that public memory is often edited by the loudest person in the room. Madison had been editing mine for years. It started small. She would correct me at family gatherings when I told old stories. That is not quite how Grant remembers it, Eleanor. She would laugh after saying it, as if the laugh softened the insult. She changed holiday traditions because my casseroles were too heavy, my ornaments too old-fashioned, my church friends too simple. She called it updating the family. I called it erasing fingerprints. By the time Thomas got sick, she had learned to speak for Grant completely. She handled the hospital visitor list. She controlled the meal schedule. She told people I was overwhelmed and needed rest when what she meant was that I was inconvenient. Once, when I arrived at Thomas's room with homemade chicken soup in a thermos, I found Madison already there with catered lunch containers from a place downtown. She looked at the thermos and smiled. That is sweet, Eleanor, but Thomas needs proper nutrition now. Thomas ate my soup after she left. He held the spoon with trembling fingers and said, "Do not let her make you feel small." I told him not to worry. That was the lie wives tell dying husbands when they want to give them peace. The service continued, and Harold remained standing near the side aisle, silent but watchful. His presence changed everything without raising his voice. Madison kept glancing at the folder in his hand, as though it might open by itself and spill out every secret she had tried to bury. When the pastor invited family members to share a few words, Madison rose quickly before I could even breathe. She walked to the lectern with practiced grace, unfolded a sheet of paper, and looked out at the chapel with moist eyes that had appeared exactly on cue. "Thomas welcomed me into this family like a daughter," she began. Her voice was smooth, warm, convincing. He trusted Grant and me to carry forward his legacy. I looked down at the program again. Beloved father, grandfather, businessman, and friend. Still no husband. Still no wife. Madison continued speaking about legacy, responsibility, and the next generation. She spoke as if Thomas had handed her the keys to his life simply because she had married our son. I saw heads nodding, especially from people who knew more about our bank accounts than our marriage. Then she made one mistake. She looked directly at me and said, "In his final months, Thomas often worried about Eleanor being unable to manage practical matters alone." The words were gentle enough to pass as concern. That was Madison's talent. She could wrap a blade in velvet and call it kindness. A few people turned toward me with pity. I felt Harold shift near the aisle. I did not move. I did not correct her. I simply looked at the woman who had laughed at my coat and listened as she tried to bury me while I was still breathing. Madison let the sentence hang in the chapel air as if she had offered me a blanket instead of a public warning. Unable to manage practical matters alone. I had heard those words before. Not in that exact order, but in the same polished tone, during whispered conversations at my kitchen island, during hospital visits when she thought Thomas was asleep, during family dinners when Grant stared into his plate and let her speak for both of them. Practical matters. That was what she called the house I had helped pay for, the business I had helped build, the accounts I had balanced, the employees whose children I remembered by name, the insurance forms I filled out when Thomas's hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She made it sound as if I had spent 43 years dusting picture frames while men handled the serious world. I sat very still and watched her perform grief with perfect posture. Thomas was a man who believed in preparation, Madison continued. He wanted his family protected. He wanted things handled smoothly, without confusion, without unnecessary conflict. Her eyes moved across the room, gathering sympathy. Grant and I intend to honor that. Grant and I, not Eleanor, not his wife, not the woman who had slept in a vinyl hospital chair for 21 nights because Thomas hated waking up alone. I remembered the last of those nights clearly. Rain tapped against the hospital window, soft and steady, and the hallway smelled of antiseptic and weak coffee. Thomas had been drifting in and out of sleep, his skin pale against the blue blanket. Around 3 a.m, he opened his eyes and asked me if Madison had brought the papers again. I told him no, though I had seen the folder in her purse earlier that evening. He looked toward the dark window and whispered, "She thinks grief will make people easy to move." I had not understood then, not fully. I thought he was tired, perhaps confused by medication and pain. I touched his hand and told him to rest. He squeezed my fingers with surprising strength. "Ellie, promise me you will not sign anything because someone makes you feel tired." That sentence returned to me now as Madison stood under the chapel lights, speaking about smooth transitions. She had been preparing for this day long before the Lilies arrived. 2 weeks before Thomas passed, she came to our house carrying soup from a restaurant and a stack of documents in a cream-colored folder. She said the papers were just basic planning forms, nothing urgent, only meant to simplify things for Grant after the service. Thomas was asleep in the recliner, and I was folding towels at the dining table. Madison set the folder beside the laundry and lowered her voice. "Eleanor, you know Grant is overwhelmed. The kindest thing you can do is let him handle the business side. You do not need that stress at your age." At your age? She always said it gently, as if age itself were a stain spreading across my hands. I opened the folder and saw words like transfer, authorization, residential arrangement, durable consent. I did not understand every line, but I understood enough to close it. "Harold handles our legal matters," I said. Madison's smile thinned. "Harold is old-fashioned. Grant has found someone more efficient." I looked at her then, really looked, and saw impatience beneath the concern. She was not trying to help me. She was trying to move me. After she left, I told Thomas. His face changed in a way I had rarely seen. Not anger exactly. Recognition. The next morning, he asked me to drive him to Harold Bennett's office. Madison thought he was going to a doctor's appointment. I helped him into the passenger seat of our old Buick, tucked a blanket around his legs, and drove 17 miles through light snow while he stared out the window at fields he had known his whole life. At a red light, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. "Give this to Harold when we arrive," he said. "And if anyone asks later, you do not remember what was in it." I almost smiled because that sounded like the Thomas the First knew. Careful, stubborn, and 3 steps ahead when it mattered. I did not read the note. A marriage needs trust in small places, especially near the end. Now, in the chapel, Harold's leather folder seemed heavier than paper should be. Madison finished her remarks with a tremble in her voice. "We ask everyone to support us as we guide this family into its next chapter." She stepped back from the lectern to polite applause, though it sounded thinner than she expected. Before she could sit, Harold moved. "Pastor," he said, calm and clear. With respect, Thomas also prepared remarks to be read if anyone publicly questioned Eleanor's capacity. The chapel froze again. Madison's hand gripped the pew. Grant whispered, "Madison, what did you say?" But she did not answer him. Harold opened the folder, removed a single sheet, and looked at me first. I gave him the smallest nod. My heart was beating hard, but my face stayed calm. Thomas had warned me not to sign when I was tired. He had not warned me that he would come back through his attorney's voice. Harold's voice filled the chapel without becoming loud. That was what made it impossible to ignore. To my family and friends, he read, "If these words are being spoken today, then someone has attempted to make my wife appear weak, confused, dependent, or unworthy of the respect she earned long before most of you knew our name." The first sound came from the back of the room, a soft intake of breath. I kept my eyes on Thomas's casket. The lilies beside it trembled slightly in the heating draft, their white petals too perfect for the ugliness unfolding around them. Harold continued, "Eleanor May Whitaker was not a passenger in my life. She was the woman who stood beside me when the first store lost money for 11 straight months. She was the one who knew which suppliers would wait and which employees could not. She was the one who signed the second mortgage with me, worked 2 jobs when needed, raised our son, kept our books, and protected my pride when I had less sense than hope." My throat tightened. I had not known he remembered all of that so clearly. In marriage, years can blur together until sacrifice becomes furniture, always present, rarely noticed. Thomas had noticed. He had simply been quiet about it. Harold turned the page. "Any person who suggests she cannot handle practical matters should first ask who handled them when I could not." A murmur passed through the chapel, low and uncomfortable. Madison looked toward the floor. Grant looked at me, and for a moment I saw the little boy who once asked if I could sew a button on his baseball uniform 10 minutes before a game. Then he blinked, and he was a grown man again, standing beside a wife whose ambition had dressed itself as concern. Harold read on. "I specifically instructed that Eleanor be listed first in my memorial materials as my wife and as co-founder of Whitaker Hardware. If that has not happened, then it was not an oversight. It was a choice." Madison flinched. "Not much. Just enough. The kind of small movement a guilty person makes when truth touches the right place." Harold paused, giving the sentence room to settle. The pastor stood silent near the lectern, his Bible held against his chest. Some of Madison's relatives had stopped looking at her. That was when she spoke, too quickly. "Thomas was ill when he wrote that. Everyone knows he was emotional near the end." Her voice cracked slightly, not with sorrow, but with panic slipping through the seam. Harold folded the paper carefully, but did not put it away. Mr. Whitaker was examined by his physician on the same day these instructions were signed. His capacity was documented. Madison's mouth closed. Grant turned fully toward her now. "You told me Dad did not want Mom involved in the planning." The chapel seemed to lean toward that sentence. Madison did not answer fast enough. In that pause, whole years became visible. The unanswered calls, the changed dinner plans, the hospital updates that reached me late, the way Madison had slowly built a hallway between my son and me, then acted surprised when I could not find my way through it. "I was trying to spare everyone stress," she said at last. Grant stared at her. "You removed Mom from the program. I adjusted the wording. You put your family in the front row. They helped with arrangements. You told me she wanted to sit back." Madison's face hardened then. The softness finally burned away. "Grant, this is not the place." But it was exactly the place, because she had chosen it. She had chosen public humiliation, polished it, printed it, and seated witnesses around it. She had believed I would shrink quietly in the second pew while she inherited not only Thomas's legacy, but the story of his life. Harold slipped the first paper back into the folder and removed another document. "There is one more instruction," he said. I felt the air change again. Madison's eyes snapped to the folder. Grant whispered, "What instruction?" Harold looked at me. I knew then that this was the part Thomas had not wanted me to carry alone. 6 weeks earlier, in Harold's office, Thomas had asked me to wait in the reception area while he spoke privately. I remembered the old clock on the wall ticking above a row of legal magazines. I remembered watching snow melt from my boots onto the mat. I remembered Thomas coming out 30 minutes later looking exhausted but strangely peaceful. On the drive home, he reached for my hand and said, "Ellie, if they are kind, none of it matters. If they are cruel, it matters very much." I did not ask what he meant. I wish I had. Harold faced the room. Mr. Whitaker added a conditional provision to his estate documents. It concerns any family member who knowingly attempts to isolate, diminish, coerce, or financially displace his surviving spouse within the period surrounding his passing. Madison whispered something under her breath. Grant went pale. I sat very still. Financially displace. There it was. The cream-colored folder. The suggested residential arrangement. The careful comments about my age. The front pew stolen from me like a rehearsal for a larger removal. Harold continued. Evidence of such conduct triggers an immediate review of inheritance rights, business voting shares, and residential protections already granted to Eleanor Whitaker. For the first time that day, Madison looked truly frightened. Not embarrassed. Not annoyed. Frightened. Because this was no longer about a code, a program, or a pew. This was about the future she thought she had already secured. I rose slowly, and no one laughed this time. I stood because Thomas had taught me that a person should rise when the truth enters the room. My knees ached, and the old shoes pinched slightly at my toes, but my back stayed straight. I did not walk to the lectern. I did not need a microphone. For most of my life, I had spoken quietly and still managed to be heard by people who wanted to listen. The people in that chapel were finally listening. Harold turned toward me with the respect of a man who understood silence was not emptiness. It was preparation. Madison's eyes followed me with a sharpness she could no longer disguise. Grant looked torn between coming toward me and staying where his wife had placed him. I looked at my son first. That was the hardest part. Not Madison. Not the whispers. Not even the missing word on the program. The hardest part was seeing Grant realize, in front of everyone, that he had allowed another person to make him small in the places where he should have been honorable. Mom, he said, but the word came out thin, almost boyish. I held up one hand, not harshly, just enough to stop him from turning the moment into an apology he was not ready to understand. Then I looked at Harold. Please finish reading Thomas's instruction. My voice did not tremble. That surprised me less than it surprised everyone else. Grief had already taken the softest part of the morning. What remained was clear and cold. Harold nodded and returned to the document. Should any attempt be made to pressure Eleanor Whitaker into surrendering her home, her voting interest, her financial independence, or her public standing as my wife and business partner, all discretionary gifts to the responsible party or parties shall be suspended pending legal review. Someone in Madison's row whispered, "Oh my goodness." Madison turned slightly, as if betrayal had come from the pew rather than from her own choices. Harold continued, "During that review, Eleanor Whitaker shall retain full residence rights to the Hawthorne Lane property, full access to all personal and joint accounts established before my death, and controlling authority over the Eleanor May Whitaker Family Trust, created to preserve my wife's security and protect the company from manipulation." I heard Madison stop breathing. The Eleanor May Whitaker Family Trust. Even I had not known the name. Thomas had always been plain-spoken, not dramatic. He did not name things after people. He barely let the store put his photograph in anniversary advertisements. But he had put my name there, where no one could remove it with a redesigned program or a careful lie. Grant stepped forward. "Harold, what does that mean for the business?" There it was. Not first, "Mom, are you all right?" Not Madison, "What have you done?" The business. I looked at him, and something old and tender in me folded itself away. Harold answered with professional calm. "It means your father placed certain shares under your mother's authority. Your role remains intact unless the review finds that you participated in efforts to undermine her rights." Grant swallowed. I did not know. Those 4 words could be innocence or cowardice. I had not decided which. Madison found her voice again, though it had lost its silk. "This is absurd. Eleanor has never wanted to run anything. She gets overwhelmed balancing a checkbook." A few faces turned toward me again, but this time the pity did not settle. It slid off. I almost smiled. Madison knew nothing about me except the version she had built to justify what she wanted. I had balanced checkbooks before she knew how to write her name in cursive. I had negotiated vendor discounts while holding a sleeping baby. I had corrected inventory errors that would have cost us thousands of dollars. But I did not list any of that. I simply reached into my coat pocket and removed the folded envelope Thomas had given me the week before he passed. I had carried it for days without opening it because he had written on the front, "Ellie, only when the room forgets who you are." That morning, in the second pew, with laughter behind me and my name missing from the program, the room had forgotten. I handed the envelope to Harold. Madison stared at it as if it were a flame. Harold opened it carefully, read the contents once, and his expression changed from solemn to resolved. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "are you certain you want this read aloud?" I looked at Thomas's photograph, the stiff gala smile Madison had chosen, and wished she had known him well enough to fear the quiet look he used when someone underestimated me. "Yes," I said. Harold unfolded the letter. "Ellie, if you are hearing this in public, then I failed to protect you while standing beside you. So I will protect you with what I leave behind." The chapel blurred for 1 second, but I blinked it clear. "Do not let them move you out of your home. Do not let them tell you the company was never yours. Do not let our son confuse comfort with loyalty. And do not mistake Madison's manners for kindness." I saw enough before I left to know what she was planning. Madison made a small sound, barely more than a breath. Grant turned to her slowly. The room waited. Harold read the final line. "If she tries to make my funeral her first step toward taking your place, let it become the first place she loses hers." Silence fell so completely that I could hear the heating system click off above us. I turned to Madison then. Not with anger. Anger would have given her something to fight. I gave her the one thing she had never expected from me: certainty. Madison did not collapse, and she did not cry. Women like Madison rarely give a room the satisfaction of seeing them fall apart. Instead, she lifted her chin, pressed her lips together, and tried to rebuild control from the ruins of her own expression. "That letter proves nothing," she said. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it because silence had become the chapel's only witness. Thomas was sick. He was suspicious near the end. He misunderstood things. I looked at Grant then, because that sentence should have wounded him too. His father had been many things in his final weeks. Tired, thin, sometimes impatient with the weakness of his own body. But he had not been confused about character. Grant rubbed one hand over his mouth, staring at Madison as if he were seeing the outline of a stranger inside the woman he had married. "What things?" he asked. Madison turned toward him quickly. "Do not do this here." "What things did Dad misunderstand?" he repeated. His voice had changed. It was not strong yet, but it was no longer hers. Madison's eyes flicked toward her parents, then toward the pastor, then toward Harold's folder. She had built her life around presentation, and presentation needs friendly lighting. This room had become too bright. Harold slipped Thomas's letter back into its envelope and placed it inside the folder. "The legal review will address the documents Mrs. Grant Whitaker presented to Mrs. Whitaker 2 weeks ago, the attempted changes to service instructions, and any communication regarding removal from the Hawthorne Lane residence." Grant's face tightened. "Removal?" He turned to Madison. "You said Mom was thinking about downsizing." The word sounded almost foolish when placed beside the truth. Downsizing. That was the gentle American word people used when they wanted an older woman to disappear without calling it exile. Madison shook her head. "She cannot maintain that house alone. Everyone knows it." I let that pass for a moment. The Hawthorne Lane house had 3 bedrooms, a wide porch, and a stubborn maple tree that dropped leaves into the gutters every October. It was not a mansion. It was a home. Thomas and I had painted the nursery yellow before Grant was born. I had planted lavender along the walkway because Thomas liked the smell when he came home from the store. The kitchen drawer still stuck unless you lifted it slightly before pulling. A house knows who has loved it. Madison only saw square footage. "I never told you I wanted to leave my home," I said. My voice was calm enough that Madison had no place to hide inside it. "You implied it," she said. "No. You hoped grief would make me too tired to disagree." Her eyes sharpened, but she did not answer. Behind her, a woman who had laughed at my coat lowered her program into her lap. I could see the shame spreading through the room in small, delayed waves. People were remembering what they had whispered. They were reconsidering every glance. Public cruelty is easy when the target seems powerless. It becomes uncomfortable when power returns wearing the same old shoes. Grant stepped away from Madison by one careful foot. It was not much, but it was the first honest movement he had made all morning. "Mom," he said, "did she bring you papers?" I looked at him. "Yes." "Why did you not tell me?" The question almost hurt more than the laughter. "Because for months, Grant, you believed whatever reached you through her mouth." He flinched. I did not soften it. A mother spends decades cushioning hard truths for her child, but there comes a day when softness becomes a lie. "I called you after the hospital changed your father's medication. Madison said you were in meetings." I called when the insurance forms needed your signature. Madison said she would handle it. I called the night your father asked for you, and you sent a text saying you would come tomorrow. He was asleep by then. The next morning, he did not ask again. Grant's eyes filled, but he looked at Madison instead of wiping them away. You told me she said it was not urgent. Madison whispered. I was protecting you. From my father? He asked. From stress, she said. There it was again. Her favorite disguise. Stress. Practicality. Concern. Words chosen carefully enough to pass through polite company without leaving fingerprints. Harold cleared his throat. For now, I recommend that the service continue according to Thomas's written wishes. The estate matters can proceed formally afterward. Madison gave a short, humorless laugh. So she gets to sit here like some wronged queen while everyone looks at me? I turned toward her fully. No, Madison. I am sitting here as his wife. The words were simple. They landed harder than anything cruel would have. The pastor stepped forward, perhaps sensing that the room needed mercy before it could endure more truth. He asked everyone to bow their heads. Around me, people obeyed. I did not close my eyes immediately. I looked once at Thomas's casket, once at Harold's folder, and once at my son standing between the woman who raised him and the woman who had used his silence. Then I lowered my head. The prayer was short, familiar, and gentle. But beneath it, something irreversible had already happened. Madison had come to the funeral expecting to arrange the first public act of my disappearance. Instead, in front of family, church members, business associates, and every person she had tried to impress, Thomas had placed me back into the story with ink, witnesses, and a voice she could not interrupt. When the prayer ended, Grant moved toward the first pew. Madison reached for his sleeve, but this time he pulled away. Grant took one step toward me, then another, as if crossing the aisle required more courage than anything he had done in years. He stopped beside the first pew and looked down at me with a face I recognized and did not recognize at the same time. There were lines near his eyes now, gray at his temples, a man old enough to know better, yet still young enough to have believed that avoiding discomfort was the same as keeping peace. Mom, he said quietly, may I sit with you? The chapel heard him. Madison heard him. I heard the small break in his voice, and for one dangerous second, the mother in me wanted to make it easy for him. I wanted to move over quickly, pat the seat, and let him pretend the distance between us had been a misunderstanding instead of a choice. But love without truth is just another kind of hiding. I looked at the empty space beside me, the space Thomas had reserved for his wife and family. Then I shifted only slightly. You may sit, I said, but do not use my grief to escape your guilt. Grant lowered himself beside me, as if the pew had become a witness stand. He did not argue. That mattered. Madison remained standing near the front row, her hand still half raised where his sleeve had slipped away. For the first time since I had known her, she looked unsure what to do with her hands. The service continued, though every word now carried a second meaning. The pastor spoke of humility, loyalty, and the quiet duties of love. I wondered if he had planned those words before Harold arrived, or if the morning had rewritten them for him too. When the hymn began, the organ filled the chapel with the old familiar sound Thomas loved. Amazing Grace. Of course, I did not sing it first. My throat was too tight. Then I felt Grant's shoulder move beside me and heard his voice, low and uneven, stumbling over the words. I closed my eyes. Not to forgive him. Not yet. Only to remember the boy who once sang Christmas carols off-key beside me while Thomas laughed from the kitchen doorway. Memory is not mercy, but sometimes it keeps bitterness from taking the whole room. When the final prayer ended, people rose slowly, uncertain of the rules now that Madison no longer controlled them. Some approached me with careful condolences, using my name as if returning something they had borrowed without permission. Mrs. Whitaker, Eleanor, Thomas spoke so highly of you. I accepted each phrase with a nod. I did not comfort their discomfort. A woman from Madison's table touched my sleeve and said, I am sorry if you heard anything earlier. If, such a small word, such a cowardly one. I looked at her until she lowered her eyes. I heard enough, I said. She stepped back, face flushed. Harold waited near the chapel doors, speaking quietly with the pastor. Madison stood alone near the lilies, while her parents gathered their coats without meeting her eyes. Her world had not ended. People like her always find another room, another tone, another story. But this room was lost to her, and she knew it. Grant remained beside me until the casket was prepared to be taken to the cemetery. When the funeral director approached, he asked gently whether I was ready. I placed my hand on Thomas's casket, the wood smooth and cool beneath my palm. I did not speak. There are goodbyes too deep for language. Behind me, Madison said, "Grant, we need to go together." He turned, and the old habit moved across his face. "Obey, smooth it over, keep things pleasant." Then he looked at me, at my gray coat, at the program folded in my hand, at Harold's leather folder by the door. "I am riding with my mother," he said. The words were not dramatic. They did not fix anything. But they were the first clean words he had spoken all day. Madison's expression sharpened. "After everything that just happened, you are choosing to embarrass me?" Grant answered softly, "No, you did that yourself." The room seemed to exhale. I walked toward the exit with Grant on one side and Harold meeting us near the aisle. Outside, the Iowa air was cold enough to sting my cheeks. The sky hung low and gray over the parking lot, and the wind tugged at the hem of my old coat. I was suddenly aware of how tired I was. Grief is heavy by itself. Public dignity makes it heavier. Harold leaned close and said, "There will be calls this afternoon. Do not answer anything from unknown numbers. Do not sign anything. I will come by the house after the cemetery." I nodded. Grant heard him and looked stricken. Was it really that far along? Harold did not soften the answer. "Farther than you seem to understand." Madison came out of the chapel then, her heels clicking hard against the walkway. She had recovered enough to wear anger elegantly. "This is not over," she said, looking at me instead of Harold. I adjusted the single mismatched button on my coat and met her eyes. "No," I said. "It is not. But it is no longer hidden." The cemetery sat 3 miles outside town, beyond a Tulane road lined with bare oak trees and quiet farm fields. I rode in the back seat of the black funeral car with Grant beside me, both of us looking out opposite windows like strangers who had once shared a kitchen table. Neither of us spoke for the first mile. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything we had failed to say while Thomas was still alive. Grant folded and unfolded the edge of his program until the paper softened in his hands. "Finally," he said, "I should have known." I watched a row of mailboxes pass by, each one leaning slightly from years of weather. "Yes," I said. He inhaled as if he had expected comfort and found a locked door instead. "I thought Madison was helping. She said you were exhausted. She said Dad did not want arguments. She said you preferred things simple." I turned to him then. "And did that sound like me?" His mouth opened, then closed. That was the answer. No, it had not sounded like me. But believing Madison had been easier than asking his grieving mother a difficult question. Outside, the sky had lowered into the color of pewter. A light wind pushed dry leaves across the cemetery road as we arrived. People gathered in small clusters near the graveside, speaking softly, careful now in the way people become careful after they realize they have been standing on the wrong side of a story. Madison arrived in a separate car with her parents. She did not come near me. That suited me fine. Harold stood a few feet away, his coat buttoned, his folder still tucked under one arm like a quiet guard dog. The graveside service was short. The pastor spoke of dust, mercy, and everlasting rest. I heard the words, but I was watching the soil beside the grave, the dark line where earth had been opened to receive the man who had slept beside me for almost half a century. No legal paper, no public correction, no exposed scheme could soften that. Justice is not a cure for loneliness. It only keeps loneliness from being used against you. When the final blessing ended, people began placing white roses on the casket. Grant offered me one. I took it, held it for a moment, then laid it gently on the polished wood. "You stubborn, wonderful man," I whispered, so quietly only the wind could have carried it. I meant Thomas. I also meant the version of him that had planned this morning from the edge of his own ending, leaving me protection when he could no longer stand beside me. After the burial, Madison tried one last time. She waited until Grant stepped aside to speak with the pastor, then approached me with a face arranged into wounded dignity. "Eleanor," she said, "I hope you realize how humiliating that was for me." I looked at her black gloves, her perfect coat, the diamond bracelet half hidden beneath her sleeve. Humiliation is arriving to bury your husband and hearing people laugh at your shoes. Her jaw tightened. "You are enjoying this." "No," I said. "That is the difference between us." For a second, she had no answer. Then she lowered her voice. You cannot run the trust forever. You cannot keep Grant from what belongs to him. I turned fully toward her. What belongs to Grant is his conscience. I hope he finds it before you spend that too. Her face changed, just a flicker, but enough to tell me the words had landed. I walked away before she could cover the wound with another polished sentence. Harold came to the Hawthorne Lane house that afternoon, just as promised. Grant came too, though I had not invited him. He stood in the foyer looking at the family photographs on the wall as if they had become evidence. Thomas holding baby Grant in the hardware store. Me cutting the ribbon at the second location. The three of us on the porch the summer Grant left for college. Madison was not in those pictures. That may have been why she had worked so hard to replace them with newer ones. At the kitchen table, Harold laid out the facts in a voice gentle enough for grief and firm enough for law. The house was protected. My accounts were secure. The trust gave me controlling authority unless I chose otherwise. Madison's attempted documents, the altered memorial plans, and her statements would trigger the review Thomas had ordered. Grant listened without interrupting. By the time Harold finished, my son looked smaller, not because he had lost money, but because he had finally seen the cost of his silence written in legal language. After Harold left, Grant remained at the table. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon polish and the coffee I had forgotten to drink that morning. "Mom," he said, "I am sorry." I stood at the sink, looking out at the lavender bushes Thomas and I had planted. Sorry is a beginning people often mistake for an ending. You will need to be more than sorry, I said. He nodded slowly. I know. I believed he wanted to mean it. That was not the same as trusting him. Madison moved out of their bedroom 2 weeks later, according to Grant, though I did not ask where she went. The review did what Thomas intended. Her access to business decisions vanished first. Then the discretionary gifts were suspended. Then people who had once accepted her version of me began remembering my name with surprising clarity. I stayed in my home. I returned to the main store on a Saturday morning wearing the same gray coat, the mismatched buttons still in place. Employees who had known me for decades stood a little straighter when I walked in. I did not make a speech. I simply unlocked the front door, turned on the lights, and placed Thomas's old hardware key on the counter beside mine. Some victories do not need applause. They sound like a door opening in a place someone tried to close to you. And every Sunday since then, I sit at my kitchen table with coffee in Thomas's mug and my own beside it, reading the paper while sunlight moves across the floor. I am still a widow. I still miss him in ways that surprise me. But I am not erased. I am not moved aside. I am not the poor old woman they laughed at in the chapel. I am Eleanor May Whitaker, wife, mother, co-founder, and the woman Thomas trusted to remain standing after everyone else showed who they were.